Candles burning for that long. Thank y'all for coming out. When Father Fitzgerald started these talks, I guess it's nearly 10 years now, they were during Advent and Lent only, so they had a very penitential feel to them. This is the first year where we try to do this 4 times a year. So we did this back at the anniversary of his death in the first quarter. We did it during Advent, then during Lent, and so this is the spring version of the night of reflection, however you'd like to call it. They tend to range from sometimes very much a sort of spiritual reflection style thing, and other times a little bit more intellectually oriented or whatever. So I hope I give you a little bit of each and it doesn't disappoint you. The topic of tonight's talk is religion. What is it good for? So I realize I'm kind of preaching to the choir, right? These are all, you are all people who are here, and you might not ponder this question very often, but we do in our church today, in the country, and maybe even throughout the world, face a kind of a crisis of there are a large number of people who don't consider themselves faithless people. They just consider themselves no religion. So when they're checking boxes, they often check the box when it comes to religion, they say none. Like they're called often the nuns, but not N-U-N-S, but N-O-N-E-S, the nuns. They don't have an organized religion that they want to be part of. So what I'd like to talk about tonight is to sort of say, what is religion good for? What are we missing when we check the box, none for religion? It's also good, I think, for those of us who could name a bunch of things they think religion is good for, but maybe are missing some of the most important things that religion. I like to look at the etymology of the word religion first, right? It sort of has a mysterious etymology. We're not exactly sure the roots of the word exactly, but there are several good candidates, and I think it's probably a combination of all of these things where we get the word religion. One word that it may have as its root is this word religare, which is, you know your Latin, it means to bind, right? To tie something together. So your religion is something that you are tied to. I'm originally from Eunice, Louisiana. There's a number of people there who go to Mass on Sunday because they are Cajun. And if you ask them, like, would you ever think about becoming one of these non-denominational churches? What if you really like the pastor? What if he really set you on fire for Jesus? Sorry, I'm just too Cajun to do that. I'm bound to it in some kind of way. Another word that could be its root is this religio or religio. It means an obligation. It is something you are obliged to do, or a kind of a reverence that you should pay, right? Today, if you look up the word religion in the dictionary, it'll just say a particular system of faith and worship. That's your standard definition that you'll get in the secular world. A particular system of faith and worship. So later I'll talk about religion maybe a little differently, as Thomas Aquinas calls it a virtue. Religion is a virtue. Or Robert Bellarmine, Saint Robert Bellarmine, a good Jesuit saint from way back when, he said that religion was 3 things. It was creed, believe, code, how you behave, and he used the old-fashioned word cult, meaning how you worship, right? The manner of worship, the old-fashioned way to use the word cult. So it was the 3 C's of creed, code, and cult, what you believe, how you behave, and how you worship. We face a problem today of people, believing that maybe parts of that definition especially the cult part, aren't important. How we worship is not so important, right? The religion part of the whole of the big picture seems less important to a lot of people. I believe the root of that problem goes all the way back to the very beginning of the modern age. By modern, I mean the beginning of the Great Enlightenment. I mean 1700s, the early 1700s. It begins with a man named Renee Descartes. Most of you remember this name from school. Sure. He was a French philosopher born in 1596, died in 1650. I'd like to talk to him today mostly for his embrace of the discipline of epistemology. It means how you come to know stuff, or what can you say you really know? How do you come to know what you know? What do you really know? You might remember him more from geometry. You remember the Cartesian grid, the XY axis on the Cartesian grid from your geometry class? It's called Cartesian after Renee Descartes. He believed that the best way to know the world was to sort of map it onto a mathematical model of geometry, that you should be able to describe most of the world geometrically, right? And so he's a pretty famous mathematician, especially for geometry. He was a pretty good natural philosopher for his day. But I'd like to talk about epistemology, how we come to know some things, and how Descartes, I think it was an honest mistake, may have led us all astray. So first, the first thing that Descartes said was, he said, where do we get our knowledge? How do we know things? Well, first it comes from, in their day they would say first and primarily from wisdom. So something that's handed on to you that's ancient is much more reliable than something you just came up with. In Descartes' day, people would have said the most sure wisdom is the oldest wisdom. If I could tell you something that was true 2,000 years ago, you should be much more interested in it than something that only seems to have just come to light today. It's a lot less, it's sort of like, yeah. So you would, wisdom was what they held in highest esteem. But he said, wisdom's kind of fallible. Those cavemen way back when, they didn't know anything. What we know today in his day, this is the 1700s now, or 1600s, he says, what we know today is so much better. We have all this technology in his day. We have all of this technology that puts us past what we used to know. Science was just becoming a thing back then. But he said better than wisdom is empirical knowledge, knowledge that you tested, knowledge that you went out and you did a survey. You went out and measured something. You tested it out yourself. And now you know it more surely than just some ancient wisdom that was handed on to you. You know it because you tested it. You scientifically tested it. Seems better, according to Descartes. Better knowledge because you tested it. Even better than that kind of knowledge, he says, is a sort of a pure logical knowledge. So 2 + 1 = 3 is the best knowledge you can have because that all happened up here. When you test something, when you do a survey, when you measure something, you can make mistakes. But when it comes to your mind is probably the best thing to trust. So those truths that your mind grasps alone, even apart from the world, might be the best truth that you can gather, according to Renee Descartes. Pure logic is the best. You might remember that he is famous for the phrase, cogito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. He got there because he said, what if I doubt everything? What if I doubt what my teachers told me in elementary school? What if I doubt what I see with my own eyes? What if I'm wrong even when I try to do complex math problems or even simple math problems? What if I'm wrong about all of that? One thing I can be sure of is this. Even if I'm wrong, I'm still thinking. And if I'm thinking, even wrongly, if I'm thinking, then I exist. Cogito ergo sum. I'm thinking, therefore I must exist. It's the bedrock of everything else he believes because he knows it's the one thing he cannot doubt. He cannot doubt his own existence because even doubting is a kind of thinking. So he says, I must exist. Cogito ergo sum. Right? I think it sounds good, right? It sounds like a pretty logical conclusion, right? And he wasn't a non-religious person himself. He went to Mass on Sundays, right? He even spent some time writing a proof for God's existence. And his proof for God's existence is sort of like this. He says, look, if I look at a hula hoop or a ring or a bracelet or anything that's circular, it's never a perfect circle. And I know that it's not perfect because somewhere in my mind I can conceive of the perfect circle, right? So there is such a thing as a perfect circle that I judge all other circles by. And therefore I know that circles exist because I can think of it, right? I have this understanding, this knowledge of what a circle is. I judge every other circle by it. He says, well, can't I do the same thing with goodness? Can't I do the same thing with goodness? I see a lot of imperfect goodness in the world, but I judge it against something I know in my mind must be real. And there must be a perfect goodness out there. So I sort of, in my mind, know that God must be real. It's more of a report on his intuition than it is a proof for God's existence, right? He's just saying, look, I just know that God is real. He's got to be there. I sense him. He's got to be there. But it's important to see that he is not rooting God's existence in the revelation of God to Moses on Mount Sinai, where God reveals his name and says, I am, He's rooting his belief in God in what's happening between his own two ears. He's saying, I'm concluding that there must be a God. And he starts all of that reasoning with saying, I think, therefore, I am, right? You have God revealing himself as I am, and you have Descartes saying, the only thing I really know is that I am. He's still a Catholic. He still has faith, but he started the whole world on this train of thought that the best knowledge, the most sure knowledge, even when it comes to religion, starts up here. It begins here. It's not what's out in the world. It's not what's true in the world. It's what's between my ears. So there we have our problem. Everything becomes subject to my knowledge. Everything becomes subject to my logic and intuition, my intellect. Everything in the world depends on me and my brain. What happens now? That was in the 1600s. What happens now? Now the contemporary problem is based in that, right? We sort of judge the whole world on how we feel inside of our heads, right? So it's not that we have all rejected religion, but we do seem to all judge religion by how we feel about it, right? And we do this for everything. We judge the goodness and badness of everything by how we feel about it. So we don't say, this movie is a good movie, objectively speaking. We say, I like that movie, or I don't like that movie. Even a great movie, I don't like it, therefore it's not good. Or sometimes we might say something like, you've said something that has offended me. I am offended, therefore you are offensive, right? You are offensive because I am offended. Like it starts with how I feel, how I perceive, how I feel about the world. It's a very common feeling to have. We judge everything now based on all that. And so those of us who do like religion, we usually say we are in favor of religion for reasons that start right here again, right? We say, I like religion. They did a Pew, I'm about to do the empirical knowledge thing. They did a survey, right? Pew Research did a survey and asked people who went to church and who didn't go to church, why? Why do you like religion? And here are the answers. Those who did go to church said their number one answer was, I want to be closer to God. I want to be closer to God. It's not a bad reason to go to church. It was the number one by a lot. Number two, they said, I want to give my children a moral foundation. Again, religion is going to do something for me that I will then pass on to my kids, or it'll pass directly to my kids. Religion is good because it'll give my kids a good moral foundation. Nothing wrong with that exactly. The third one is, I want religion to make me a better person. Again, religion is going to do something for me. Religion is good because it does something for me. Right? A number of people said, I like religion as in comfort in times of trouble. Religion does me good because I'm comforted. When things get rough, I don't like the way I feel. Religion has a way of giving me hope. Hope is like a virtue. Hope's a good thing, right? Hope's a very good thing. All of these reasons people go to church, they're all good. But there's missing from all of those answers. Not one person in this survey gave an answer that didn't begin with, what is religion going to do good for me? They all said religion has to be good for me or for my children in some kind of way. Religion is good for you. It is good. But the way that everyone responded in a way that sort of comes from the way Descartes looked at the world, right? Why did people say they didn't go to church? Why don't they practice their religion? The number one reason people said they didn't practice religion was not because they don't believe. The number one answer they gave for why they didn't practice religion was this. They said, I practice my faith in other ways. I don't need religion. I practice my faith in other ways. There's a need inside of them that is stronger than disbelief. Right? A need inside of them to somehow practice their faith. It's just not fulfilling to be part of a religion to these people who don't go to church. The second answer, which was like 28%, the people said they just don't believe. They're not a believer. Okay. 26% said no reason at all. It's just not very important. I don't know. It's just not very important. The same number of people that didn't believe, almost the exact same number said religion is just not important. I don't really have to give you a reason why. Another number, very close to the number of non-believers and to the people who said religion just wasn't important, are people who said, I haven't found a church I like. I don't practice religion because I haven't found a church I like. A number of people said, I don't like the sermons. I said, man, if that's the reason people don't go to church, I'm in trouble. I'm running people off. Bad sermons, right? I don't like the sermons. A good chunk of people said, I don't feel welcome. I don't go to church because I don't feel welcome. And then a smaller percentage says, I don't have the time. Now look, if you don't have the time for a Jesuit mass, right? Something's wrong, right? Starting at 4 o'clock on Saturday till the late mass at Immaculate Conception at Jesuit Church, downtown, you got a lot of time for the 35 minutes that mass takes for a Jesuit mass on Sunday. That's a Sunday mass, right? You can't find 35 minutes for that. Parking's bad, maybe. That should have been on the survey. Parking is terrible. And this is a survey from 2018, so this was before COVID. 9% of the people said, well, for health reasons, I can't go to church. I don't go to church because I really can't. I have a health problem. And then another 7% said the church is not there's no church in my area, so I can't go to church. So a few people have what I would consider pretty valid excuses for not going to church. But everyone else, they all sort of centered it on reasons that seem real, reasons that seem compelling, reasons I could kind of relate to in some ways. I don't always like the sermon. Even when I'm giving it, I might not like the sermon, right? Or I don't always feel welcome, or I don't always feel, so these are not crazy excuses or reasons for not participating in a religion, right? So Robert Bellarmine said, here's the definition for Robert Bellarmine. He said it's the creed, it's the code, and it's the cult. So for the creed, it's a set of beliefs. It's what you believe, and it's a wisdom that has been passed down really through, we call it, in old-fashioned words, we call it the faith of our fathers, or we talk about the martyrs, the people who died for this set of beliefs, right? Died for this creed, these martyrs. It's also a constitutive element that, you can't say, I like those things that the church teaches, as a creed. You have to actually believe it if you're going to practice the religion. You can't just say, I think it's cool what they believe, You say, I have to believe it. The same thing with code, right? So the code is how you behave, how your religion asks you to behave. It's, we need, or we feel the need for this non-arbitrary force that's going to sort of tell me how I should act. And most of us feel the need for that. We don't want to just do whatever we feel like doing. We want someone to guide us. We want someone to push us to act right and do the right things. But it's not like I just like the code. Actually live it to practice your religion. You can't just say, I think it's interesting what I'm told I have to act like. You have to actually act that way. And finally, for Catholics, there's an emphasis on the way we worship, what Robert Bellarmine calls the cult, the way that we worship, right? It's also a constitutive element, right? You can't just say, I think the Mass is so pretty, I think it's a wonderful thing that those Catholics do. If you are a Catholic, participating in it becomes part of what makes you a Catholic, right? You have to believe what we believe. You have to act the way we act, and you have to worship the way we worship. You have to do it. When you turn to the Gospels, I say that because Catholics, we have the Mass. There are a lot of Christians out there who don't have the Mass, right? And they think that it's not very biblical. They think you can read the Bible front to back, and the priesthood and Mass, somehow it passed away with the Old Testament. And Jesus starts something new where it's much more focused on accepting the gospel, right, as opposed to a liturgical act, right? We have the Mass. Non-Catholic Christians sort of take the Mass out of it, and they tend to say it's much more about sort of receiving the Word of God somehow. But we don't. We believe there is a priesthood and a Mass that has to be part of our religion. We believe that because if you read the Bible closely, you see from the beginning, right, in the very beginning of the Gospel of Matthew, we get a genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David. The title Son of David for Jesus throughout the Gospels is a very important title, and I believe that that title will point us the way to understanding why religion is so important. It says Jesus, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, Son of David. It's also in Luke. Luke also traces Jesus' genealogy back through David. See, David exercised a priestly ministry as he was king. We think of him as King David. If you read the Old Testament, it shows that David was actually both king and a priest at the same time. How did this happen? How do we know this? In 2 Samuel chapter 6, we see that David was girded with a linen ephod, right? An ephod is a chasuble. It's what Father Dyer and myself were wearing during Mass. It was a priestly garment, right? And that only priests were allowed to wear this, and King David is described as wearing this ephod in 2 Samuel chapter 6. It said that David cared for the Ark of the Covenant, right? So Moses had put in the ark the 10 Commandments. He also put some bread, the manna that had come down from heaven. He also had the staff of Aaron put into that box. And so, the Ark of the Covenant was something that got to be cared for by the priests. And it describes David as caring for the ark. He also set up the tent, right, that would house the ark. That was a job for the Levites. The Levites were the Jewish priestly caste. And David was there doing that work. It says that David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings. That's a priestly job. It also said that David blessed the people in the name of the Lord. Only people allowed to speak the name of God, to be blessed in the name of the Lord, were priests. Only priests were allowed to say God's name that had been revealed to Moses, right? If you remember 2 Samuel chapter 5, Saul gets in trouble for trying to do what David had been doing. Saul gets in trouble for making offerings because he's only a king. Saul is not a king and a priest. He's only a king. And so he gets in trouble for making an offering. There's a priest that's taking too long to get there, and Saul's getting impatient. So Saul makes the offering himself, and God is angry when it's all said and done. When David conquered Jerusalem, this is what makes him a priest. When David conquered Jerusalem, he became the successor to the previous kings of Jerusalem. One previous king of Jerusalem, his name was Melchizedek. You remember that Melchizedek shows up a few times in the Old Testament and even in the New. Melchizedek is named as he's the king of Salem, which is the same city as Jerusalem, right? So Melchizedek is the king of Salem. And it says that Melchizedek made offerings of bread and wine. That he made offerings of bread and wine. And he was not a Hebrew. He was not an Israelite. He was not a Jew. Melchizedek was somebody from outside of the chosen people of God, and yet God accepted his offerings of bread and wine. And so when David takes over Jerusalem, David inherits that power to be the king of Jerusalem and a priest at the same time, something Saul had not done. King David receives his priesthood through Melchizedek. Okay? And Melchizedek passed on his priesthood different from the Jewish priesthood. The Jewish priesthood was, you had to be a Levite. You had to be from the tribe of Levi, right? For Melchizedek, it was just whoever came next. Whoever the next king was, they had the same power to be both a priest and a king. So David's sons are mentioned as kings. They're Kohanim is the name for priests in Hebrew. When Jesus in Matthew violates the Sabbath, pay close attention to what happens. I'll read it. This is from Matthew chapter 12. Pay close attention. He says, Jesus says, after he's walking along the side of the road, he's picking wheat with his hands, and his apostles are doing the same things. And so everybody says, we got you. Working on the Sabbath. You're not allowed to work on the Sabbath, right? Jesus says, have you not read what David did when he was hungry and those who were with him, like Jesus and his apostles, how he entered the house of God and he ate the bread of the presence, which it was not lawful for him to eat, nor for those with him, but only for priests? Or haven't you not read in the law how on the Sabbath the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are guilty? So Jesus is saying, look, have you not read that David was doing these priestly things, right? And David was not a Levite, and yet he was doing priestly things. There's a priesthood there that Jesus and his apostles are claiming. Not the Levite priesthood. It's not the priesthood of the Sadducees in the temple who are slaughtering the lambs. It's the priesthood of Melchizedek, David had inherited when he took over Jerusalem. Jesus is claiming this priestly privilege for himself and for his assistants. If you ask any Jewish person that kind of language that Jesus was speaking, they recognize that as Jesus grasping or claiming for himself and for his apostles a kind of priesthood. Rabbi Jacob Nussner, who's he's been dead for a while now, several decades, but a very famous Jewish scholar. He looked at the life of Jesus in the Gospels. He says, there's no way that Jesus is not claiming to be a priest. In fact, that's probably one of the reasons why the Jews had him executed. One of the reasons why the Jews really didn't like him, because he claimed that priesthood himself. And that priesthood that Jesus was claiming comes with an authority, right? There's a certain kind of authority. If you read in Deuteronomy chapter 17, it says, if any case arises requiring decision between one kind of legal right and another, any case too difficult for you, then you shall go up to the Levitical priest, the priest of Aaron, and you shall consult them, and they shall declare to you the decision. The man who does not obey the priest shall die. That's good old-fashioned Deuteronomy language, right? If you get it wrong, you're going to die, So it's pretty serious that the priest carries with him a lot of authority. And so then Jesus, speaking to his apostles, Gospel of Matthew, he says, and I tell you, you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. And whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. All your homilies will be great, and no, he doesn't say that, right? He says you have this authority that to bind and loose. This is a major thing that you have that won't always feel good to the people that you minister to. Right? This binding and this loosing comes from this royal kingly authority that Melchizedek had and the apostles had. Right? So the church, as we know it today, has the very same thing, right? The church has two sort of ways of being authoritative. The first is when the Pope says something, right? The Pope, he's the boss, but also a council of the other apostles. So Jesus tells Peter, you have the authority to bind and loose. He also tells the other apostles later on, you also have the power to bind and loose as a group. So we have Peter, the Pope, apostles, bishops, right, when they get together for an ecumenical council. So to sum it up, what I've said so far, priests, according to the Bible, come in two flavors, right? You have the Aaron Levitical priests, have Melchizedek. Aaron is ruling these Levite priests. Melchizedek is ruling. He has this ruling priesthood, not necessarily Jewish, though. Aaron sacrificed sheep in the temple, right? Melchizedek had bread and wine. Jesus counts as the Paschal Lamb and as the priesthood which he shares with his apostles, making it an order of Melchizedek. He tells his apostles, you go and do this in memory of me with the bread and the wine, which we now understand is Christ. Passed on to his apostles the priesthood of Melchizedek. So if religion is the creed, the code, how we behave, and the cult, how we worship, Jesus passed on a way of worshiping by naming his apostles priests, right? He's telling us how we are supposed to live out this religion, how we are supposed to be religious, what it's really good for. So when we say, I go to church because I want to be closer to God, not bad, but that's not what a priest is for, right? A priest is there to make an offering to God the Father. A priest owes it to God. Right? When we say, I want to give my children a moral foundation, that's just a tiny piece of what religion really is. Our religion is a big part making an offering to God on this altar. When we say, I want to go to church so that I will be made a better person, no doubt you'll be better if you go to church. I'd hate to see you if you didn't go to church, right? But when you go to church, you don't first go so that you'll be made a better person. You go to church because you owe God a sacrifice on that altar. People say, I go for comfort in time of trouble. I hope so. I hope you're comforted. But the real reason you go to church is to make an offering on the altar. You owe it to God. Thomas Aquinas talks about religion as a virtue because he says religion is something that, like justice, right? He says it falls under the category of justice. He says because we owe worship to God, religious worship to God. First of all, what is a virtue, right? A virtue is, according to Thomas Aquinas, a good quality of the mind by which we live righteously, of which no one can make bad use, which God works in us and outside of us. A virtue is like a disposition in our abilities that perfects those abilities. It puts those abilities to good use to produce good actions. Think of like a virtue. Virtues sort of work the way that lifting weights works. You know, you need some strength to lift a little bit of weight. And the more you lift a little bit of weight, the stronger you get. And if you do this consistently, if you practice this consistently, it becomes kind of like a part of who you are. You can grab those weights and lift big, heavy weights, and you know exactly the motions that you need to make, and you build upon these kind of muscles that are growing from their use. So religion works the very same way. When you practice that religion, you get better and better at doing it, right? You get better and better at doing it. So he said, Thomas Aquinas says we have these sort of two capacities. We have a capacity to know and a capacity to desire, right? The intellect to know and the will, this thing that you desire. He says you have, of course, intellectual virtues and you have moral virtues. Intellectual virtues, how well you can think and put into practice, and moral virtues, right? How you're going to will the right good thing, right? So he says it's the moral virtues that direct our desire to good deeds. So if you're practicing your religion, it will make you a better person performing good deeds. If you're practicing, if you get this right. So religion is a virtue and it falls under justice. Right? You remember the virtues probably from back in school, right? You had justice and you had temperance and you had fortitude and you had prudence. You know, when we talk about justice, we mean people get what they deserve in the most basic definition. Justice means people get what they deserve. If you say criminal justice, you mean criminals get what they deserve, right? Criminals don't get away with it. They get what they deserve. If you say social justice, you mean that you're working on setting up a society so that the little guy gets what he deserves. The little guy gets what he needs, gets his needs met. That's what justice means. Justice is concerned with rights, right? You know, justice is concerned with the ability to, you know, for example, a natural right, like a God-given right to life, for example, or a right based on some agreement that you made with somebody else, that you agree that you're going to pay them for their work or something like that, right? So justice is giving to each what they are due. Guess what? God is due everything from us. God is due our whole person. God is due all that we are be offered as a sacrifice. That's what God is offering. That's what justice means when it comes to God. How I treat my neighbor, he should get what he deserves. God got what he deserved, everything. It'd be everything, all that we are. So, if religion is first for us, you know, like how I feel, how I'm comforted, or I'm instructed, or I like the homily, or if religion is for us in any kind of way, and we miss that religion is really it's what God deserves from us, then we miss everything. If it's for us in any kind of way at all, it's for our salvation, okay? Religion, we can say religion exists for our salvation, right? John Paul II, he says in his letter, Redemptoris Homines, he says, our spirit is set in one direction. The only direction for our intellect, will, and heart is toward Christ our Redeemer. Toward Christ, Redeemer of man. We wish to look towards him because there is salvation in no one else but him. What if you thought about church that way? What if you thought about church as that's the place where you will find your salvation? Would you say, I want to be closer to God? Okay, but you also don't want to wind up in hell, right? I want to give my children a moral foundation, right? Yeah, but you want them to act right, but you also want them to end up in heaven, right? I want it to make me a better person, sure, but you also want to end up in heaven. I want comfort in times of trouble, right? Also want to end up in heaven, right? Religion exists, if it's for you, if there's anything personal about it, for your own good. It's for your own salvation. Salvation itself. Not that religion causes our salvation, or not that religion achieves our salvation, but rather it directs us, like a virtue should, it directs us towards the cause of our salvation, Christ, right? Jesus. So we then have sort of acts of religion that are worth looking at, right? Interiorly, we have religion. Interiorly would promote our devotion to God, right? Our submittal to God, letting God be God, right? So we can really be us, right? That's submittal to God. A readiness inside, an interior sense of a readiness to say yes to God, whatever He asks, right? An elevation of our mind towards God, right? Interiorly, we stop worrying about so much these terrestrial things and we look up to God at the celestial things. And exteriorly, religion should make, we have acts like adoration, right? We have acts like sacrifices and oblations and tithes and vows, right? Vows made at an altar of sacrifice. That's what religion is. Or that is what God deserves from us. Think about the most religious prayer we can pray. Okay, so somebody who checks the nuns, they just sort of have a feeling, right? They say, God's good. I believe in God. He's good. Therefore, I'm not a religious person, but I know God is good. A religious person will pray, all Christians everywhere will pray the Our Father. First two petitions of the Our Father are aimed at the purpose of religion. Our Father, who is in heaven, hallowed be thy name. It's a petition. You're asking God that his own name be treated as holy. Hallowed be thy name, and thy kingdom come. Right? A petition that puts God first, front, and center. Right? Hallowed be thy name, thy kingdom come. And then you move to the means. Will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us this day our daily bread. Give us what we need to live up to this, right? And remove all the obstacles to us giving you what is due. Remove our sin. Forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, something that would keep us from giving all that we are to you, God, as an act of religion. Remove all those obstacles. When it comes to forgive us our trespasses, I think that might be one of the most significant parts of what I'm trying to say. I see a lot of very familiar faces, people who were here the last time I gave a talk. You might remember I had a whiteboard out here. I had a hard time flipping it over. Mr. McMahon here helped me flip it over. It was the talk about the render unto Caesar, right? Some of y'all who were here might remember some of that talk. Render unto Caesar. What was the point of that whole thing except to say that we are in the image and likeness of God, and therefore we owe God all that we are? We are also a priestly people. All the things I've been saying about priests and religion apply to everybody. Apply to everybody in the pew. We all gather around that altar and offer the same prayer on the altar. Pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father. You all say, Lord, accept the sacrifice at your hands, but it's really our sacrifice. It's the sacrifice at the priest's hands, but it's all our sacrifice. So if there's a real reason to be religious, not only because you owe it to God, you owe God religion, you can also offer God religion on behalf of others. You can also sanctify all those nuns, right? All those people who say, I don't have a religion. You have a way of sanctifying those nuns if you live religion to the best of your ability. If you give God all that you have, you can make the whole planet holy, right? You can save the world. You can save the world by giving all that you are. You become like Christ. If Christ's death on the cross counts for me, then my offering to God on the altar has to be able to count for those people I know who don't practice their religion. Religion, what is it good for? Well, you owe it to God. but also owe it to your fellow man. You have to be as religious as you can be. Let it sink in. Bring other people to church when you come to church. Go to church on Sundays. Every 5 minutes if you go to a church. That's what religion's good for. Thank y'all very much. May God bless y'all, and thank y'all for coming. On a normal night like tonight, we would invite y'all to Kool-Aid and cookies and all that kind of stuff. We don't have it tonight, so I'm sorry. We'll have to just say hello to each other on the way out. Thank you.